Game 6 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. The game lasted 136 moves, the world record for the longest game played in a World Championship, beating the previous one of 124 moves between Viktor Korchnoi and Anatoly Karpov. Magnus was white and went ahead with his Catalan opening, as we have seen before. But in this game, instead of the standard move c4, Magnus chose quieter line b3, hoping to just get a normal middle game position and playing for a long fight. And he did get a long fight in this game. So c5 from Jan, and then takes, and bishop takes. And now Magnus played c4, and Jan took the pawn. And now Magnus revealed his idea with queen c2, threatening to take this pawn. And the point obviously is that if black takes here, then the bishop falls. So Jan defends that with queen e7. And now Magnus played an amazing move, knight b to d2, sacrificing a pawn, which really set Nepo thinking. Because it's not obvious how white is getting compensation for this lost pawn, but as we shall see, there is. If pawn takes pawn, knight takes. And now white is playing to trade off this bishop, and he's hoping for compensation with his two bishops, which will be extremely powerful on the board. So for example, let's say bishop d6, then knight f to d2, and this knight's coming to c4, hitting this guy, who unfortunately he cannot move here because bishop a3 hits the queen and hits the rook as well, and this is a lost position already. So black would play something like rook d8, and then after rook d1, bishop here, maybe trying to save it, but a3, and it's still lost. And Magnus would have loved playing this sort of position with a pawn down, but having two really strong bishops. So another line is to try to delay this bishop from coming to a3 with a move like bishop b4 to provoke a3, so that this bishop can get here immediately, and then play bishop d6. But even there, with now you see he can drop him back because bishop a3 is not on just yet. Even there, white plays a4 and gets bishop a3, and black can drop to e8 with his rook protected. But with a move like rook d1, white is definitely pressing, and it's not a comfortable position for black to play. So this was probably all Magnus's preparation, which is why Nepomniachtchi didn't take the pawn, but he just developed his piece. Sensible decision, knight c6. So Magnus took. And now he played a really nice move with pawn to b5, which solves his opening problems. Because once this knight moves away, which is what Magnus did, knight e5, the idea was obviously not to take here, but to play knight b4, hitting the queen. If he takes, then knight takes e5, and this rook is threatened. And that's creating a really awkward situation for black, because if bishop e7, then well, he'll trade, and then this guy's falling. So we'd have to play a move like knight d5 in the position, but then knight c6, queen d6, and e4, fuel to the fire. And if this knight moves, then simply e5, and the bishop is falling. So knight takes is not a good move, but knight b4 saves the knight from the attack, hits the queen, queen has to move, and then bishop b7, and black's problems are solved. His rooks are connected, his bishop is on the long diagonal, so he has no issues in this position. So Magnus played slowly with a3, kicks this knight back, and knight d3. He's not trading pieces, he wants to keep his pieces on the board for a long game. Bishop drops back. Bishop g5, so he is wanting to create some weaknesses in black's camp. Rook d8, and he takes. So black's going to have a double pawn. Now Nepo played g takes f6, so he wants to keep his queen on, because as long as the queen stays on, white's king can come under some fire with black's two bishops. Plus, if he trades queens, then only white is perhaps playing for any sort of long-term advantage, because once this happens, there is a weakness here on c5, which could be exploited with rook c1 and b4 and so on. So Nepo chose gf6. And now rook c1. And here there was a possibility of playing e5, which Nepo rejected, and probably with good reason, because optically it looks really nice. You're threatening e4, but that creates an unfortunate weakness here on the f5 square, and that could be dangerous in the long term. So let's look at a sample line: knight h4, knight d4, b4. Now white's clamping down on this square here. Takes, rook c8, e3 kicks this knight back, check here. And now black has to go back to maintain the balance, but let's say he goes here just to illustrate what could happen. Takes, knight e1, saying no problem, I save my knight, your king side is quite weak. And rook trades, and queen d2 just covering these squares. And if black gets greedy, black can still hold this, but if black gets greedy here, these weaknesses are going to tell. For example, queen b3, knight h4, going after the king side, takes, and queen d6 protects this guy, but more importantly takes here next, and then knight f5, and black is crumbling. So that's a dangerous line. So e5 didn't happen. Instead, he goes knight d4 and takes. Queen a2, queen is attacked, queen moves away. Bishop takes, check here. Queen e4. Black is doing perfectly fine, but he doesn't have any immediate threats, and Magnus just plays quietly here, brings his rook into the center, and now Nepo offers him a trade of 2 rooks for a queen. There was the option of playing b4 with the idea of planting this bishop here, which was probably the safer option for Nepo, because let's say if takes, and if knight takes b4, then bishop takes f2, check, takes, and takes that guy. So this trade, followed by a move like bishop c3, could have given Nepo a pretty reasonable position, but I think that he assessed that white's pawns here are quite weak if this queen is lost. So after rook c8 and Magnus took here, because Magnus also wanted to create an imbalance in the position, because if he plays a move like queen d1, that's passive, and I haven't examined this particular line in detail, but I remember seeing the analysis for this one, and it's not giving white anything to play for. He's defensive. So Magnus instead chose queen takes c8, so that he at least gets an active position with his 2 rooks, and it creates an imbalance in the position, and a huge one at that. So queen d5, attacking b3, and Magnus plays b4. And Nepo shuts it out with a4. And now these 2 guys here are quite weak. And Nepo's long-term plan is going to be to eliminate this guy, which will make that guy weak. And with his bishop and queen, he can probably grab that guy as well, and then his 2 passed pawns will win the game. But obviously that's easier said than done. Magnus saw the threat of queen b3 and decided to play e3 first. So for example, let's say if he plays h4, then queen b3 immediately, and the pawn is falling. So e3, bishop backs off. He could have played bishop b2 in this position, and I'm sure that he saw this, but he was trying to complicate the game for Magnus, because Magnus was low on time at this point. So he was avoiding moves that would be quite obvious for white to respond to, because here rook c5, queen d6, and rook takes b2 is a pretty obvious try for white. And after queen takes d3, white could play rook to c2, move his rook to safety, and if he takes here, then takes there, and this pawn's not going anywhere. For example, here, then rook just comes down there, and if he tries to push, then both rooks gang up on that pawn just in time and win. There's another subtle point to that line, which I'll show you later, but bishop b2 was nevertheless a reasonable try in this position. But Nepo played bishop e5, saying I can go bishop b2 later. I don't have to do it right away. And Carlsen played h4. And after h5, he moves his king to h2, moves it off the back rank, which gives him a lot more possibilities later for this rook to get active. For example, now if bishop b2, as happened in the game, Magnus had rook c5, which is what he did, and queen d6, and then he missed the incredible computer move rook back to c2. Because now if takes, then knight f4 hits the queen, and if queen takes here, let's say, then white starts to pile up on f7 and goes on to win the game, because there is no defense. Takes, and now black could, well, first of all, rook takes f7 is inaccurate, but because of bishop d6, because black is controlling h7, because check, king h8, no problem, knight g6, but queen takes. So as long as the queen's controlling these two squares, that's not on. But here, knight takes h5 was winning, and now white could play like this. First grab this pawn, and then double up and win the queen that way. Or if, let's say, queen b1, then rook g8 here, and g4, and this king is getting checkmated. So that was an incredible line that Magnus missed. So let me go back to the previous bishop b2 line and show why it wasn't working when the king was on g1. So imagine instead of playing bishop e5, Jan had played bishop e2 here. You may say, okay, what's the difference here? Rook c5, queen d6, and rook c2 again. Now takes, knight f4, queen takes b4, rook d7. The problem here is queen b1 is check, and this guy is falling. So by allowing Magnus to play h4 and king h2, he took away that possibility for himself. And then when bishop b2 happened, he created that threat of rook c2, which obviously Jan didn't see, and Magnus didn't see it either. He should have played queen b3, going after this pawn, but I guess he understood that this is too easy a position for white. White could just take this guy, and after takes, rook c7, and he piles up on that guy, and it's worst case scenario, white's getting a draw in this position, because he's always got perpetual checks here, but black here has to be careful to avoid defeat. For example, white could play rook a7, a3, and now e4, threatening rook g7 and checkmate. Actually, that's a beautiful mate, which I should show, because for example, a2, then it's not rook g7 immediately, but g4 of all moves. Because now if takes, well, first of all, g4, let's say queens, right? And then check here, and g5 is just made, right? So he takes, and then king g3, amazingly. And if queens now, then check here, and then h5, and rook check here, and rook g6 is checkmate. So some really beautiful lines here, but black could play to attack this guy with a move like queen e2, and then it is a draw. White has to take a perpetual check here, like that. Because a rook here, then there is no after king f6, there is no check. So white can just move this rook and take a perpetual check. There's also another interesting line here with knight c5, take rook d8. But here after f5, knight d7, for example, queen b2, black is holding, and rook g8 comes to nothing. So white would probably play something like knight d3 and try to hold the balance this way. But it's easier said than done with a pass pawn like that. Of course, black's position can also be tricky with white's rook so powerful and the knight jumping into f4 at some point. So this was double-edged. So anyway, Magnus got this position and he played rook d1, which was quite a puzzling move, and obviously a bad move, because after bishop takes a3, He didn't have anything more than rook takes b5, but then he had missed queen d7. Because now let's say if rook b6, then queen c7 attacks this guy. After he moves queen c2, and one of these two pieces is falling. So Magnus had to play rook c5, and it's unclear why Jan did not take this pawn here, because it is a free pawn, and Magnus obviously can't take because this guy is dropping. But I guess he was trying to put Magnus under time pressure, because Magnus was on his last few minutes on the clock before the time control on move 40, and this here is move 34 with queen d7. So Jan played e5 with the idea of stopping knight f4, which makes sense. His argument is that this pawn isn't really going anywhere. I'm trying to make it as difficult for you to make good moves as I can. So you can't really blame him for not taking this pawn here. Rook c2, Magnus tries to get into a reasonable position. Queen d5 and rook d2, now both his rooks are defended. Queen b3, now he cannot take this anymore because the knight defends it. So queen b3 and rook a2, because now if bishop takes, then well, rook could come to b2 this way, and that guy is lost. So here the bishop is really in danger of getting trapped, and Jan played e4, which was inaccurate. He failed to find the engine-like move f5, which threatens e4, I imagine, but it also protects e4 once e4 is played. So and knight takes e5, well, bishop takes b4 is not is a move, but it's not the best move. Bishop c1 actually is the right idea, because once you get this configuration with the bishop and the pawn holding each other like that, then black is completely safe. More than that, it's white who needs to be careful, and he can be with knight c4, because now if a2, then well, just takes, and black cannot go for a sack of the queen like this, because this pawn is just too dangerous and he's running fast. So that was a good defensive setup, but Jan was not thinking defensive here. He was thinking of going on the offensive, because white was down to his last few seconds. Magnus was down to 1 minute when rook c2 was played in this position. So Jan was trying to create some pressure. This is move 38, so last two moves left for Magnus. He plays knight c5, Jan takes, and now on move 40, just one move before time control, Magnus missed rook d to c2, which would have been an excellent move, because these guys are completely paralyzed. The queen is protecting that, and the bishop cannot move. The queen can't move either. And black would be forced to play a move like f5 to hold this, but then knight takes a4, and if it takes, then rook c3 and gobbles up this pawn. And sure, white can black can try to play queen f3 and create some sort of a fortress here, but with proper play, white can get an advantage even in that position. So I'm not going to go into that detail, because that you could have a whole lecture on this, how white can break this apparent fortress. So knight takes e4 was played, and after queen b3 they reached time control. And so Nepo is now playing for the same idea with bishop c1 and pawn to a3. So Magnus plays rook c2, stopping that idea, and Nepo drops bishop to f8. Knight c5, queen b5, knight d3, pawn to a3. And white doesn't really have much here in this position thanks to this pawn here on a3. So he has to play for grabbing that guy at some point. Magnus first plays knight h4, hitting h5. More importantly, he's threatening to perhaps go behind this pawn with rook c7, rook a7. But Nepo says nothing, doing queen a5, threatening to push this pawn if one of these rooks gets too forward. so Magnus blocks it. Bishop b4, rook d3, preventing bishop c3 ideas. Because if bishop c3 here, then I guess knight takes h5 is a possibility, because the queen can't defend both pieces at the same time. So king h6 was played defending the pawn, and now Magnus goes here. Because now if bishop c3, then he has rook d5 and rook takes h5 again. So that's still not on. So queen a4 and rook a1. So now he stopped bishop c3 in this way. But he has a concrete plan of bringing this knight over to grab this guy. So bishop d6, king g1, queen b3, knight e2 here, knight d4, and he's going to play knight c2 and takes. Whoops. So king h7 was played, and king h2 getting off the first rank, as we've seen before. Queen e4. Nepo here seemed too relaxed, and he lost the thread of the position. I think that he underestimated White's chances, or that he didn't see a defense to the idea of knight c2 and take, so he thought he could counterattack. But there's actually an easy defense. King g7. If knight c2, then bishop e5 hits this guy, and he has to move. But once he moves, you can just go back to d6 and hold that pawn again. So that was an easy maneuver that Black had. Instead, he played queen e4 here, and that's probably the move that lost him the game. Because once this happened on the board, Magnus took his chance of playing rook takes a3. He thought hard on this one. And now from this point on, it's going to be a huge struggle for Black to hold this game. I mean, objectively, Black should still hold, but subjectively, as a human being, it's extremely hard to find accurate defensive moves. So queen e4, I think, is the move that cost him the game. And also because it was played pretty fast and casually without thinking too much. Queen e4 takes, and takes, of course, was the point. You can't take it spinned. But king g1 was the move that Nepo probably underestimated or missed. Because if king g2, then check here, and then takes, and then h4. And once Black gets h4 and this is opened up, then Black has an easy draw in that position. But king g1, Black does not have time for h4, because queen's attacked. And if bishop takes g3, then takes, and king f1, and the king is safe. So Black has to play queen e4 and hope for h4, but Magnus stops that with rook a4. Because now if h4, then you just move the knight away, and then take on h4 with check, and that's winning. So here is where things started to get really bad for Nepo. He played bishop e5. It's still not lost, but now Magnus is clearly pushing, and he kept moving around to see if Nepo would crack, and he held for quite a bit. Magnus now got both his rooks up here to force a checkmate, so that forced him to push this pawn up here and create a new weakness on f5 here. And Magnus went after that one slowly but surely. So the next few moves are not strictly relevant. Magnus slowly but surely kept moving back and forth. He has no need to rush. He just has to keep moving and find a way to get to this pawn. And the more he makes apparently useless moves, the more difficult it gets for Black, because Black cannot know for sure if the move is useless or White has a threat. So that just makes it psychologically an extremely difficult position for Black to play. Rook e5, here rook b7, queen c2, rook b5, goes back, rook a5. He cannot take here because queen d3 hits this guy, and unfortunately both these rooks are also attacked. So if rook e5, then take, and then take there. So he couldn't do that, but rook a5, and now he goes here, rook b5 again, goes back. Now he takes, queen d3, and he sees a different line. Rook takes f7, takes, and rook b7. king g6 and takes. And now white has, humanly speaking, a lasting advantage in this position because only white is playing for the win here with these passed pawns. Queen d5, rook a6. They shuffled around. Magnus tried various configurations here to prevent his king from getting checked and moved back and forth quite a bit. Shuffling around, but he was not finding anything concrete. And then he came back with his knight on f3, queen b1, rook d7, rook d2, knight g1. He tried everything. You have to give him credit for trying. Rook d4, knight e2. And finally he gets e4. So he's got something going. And he plans to push the e pawn and the f pawns in the near future. Queen h1, rook d7, rook d4, queen h2 here. And Nepo decided, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to open up lines against your king, which is the right thing to do. So now white has two passed pawns with a rook and a knight, and the endgame table bases show that this is a draw, but obviously from a human perspective, it is not drawn easily. And this is the moment that Nepo went wrong. He should have played queen to h1, and the idea is that the queen controls the squares on the king side, so it's far more difficult for this king to find shelter behind his own pawns, because this on the king side is the shorter side of the board given these pawns here, whereas if the king were here, that would be the longer side of the board, and there's far more room for the queen to check him there than there is here. So white's king wants to be on this side, so there's not much room for the black queen to check him. So if Nepo had simply stayed here, then it would not be easy for Magnus to make progress. But he went the other direction, which allowed Magnus to come into this corner here, and now you can see that his king is completely safe from checks. And from here on, it became really difficult for Nepo to find the right moves. And as you can see now, white's pawns are advancing. And this, by the way, this rook and the pawn structure like this, in rook endgames, in purely rook endgames, this is called the autopilot structure, because the rook can simply move like this, and then against another rook, it can simply play e6, f5, then rook f7, e7, f6, rook f8, and queen, and so on. But obviously against a queen, you can't do that. And with the king facing you, you can't easily do that. But you have a knight as well. So the knight will do the job of protecting the rook. Once the rook gets there, the knight will defend that rook, and then the pawns can start moving. So he got this structure here, and now it became really hard for Nepo. His last chance was to, again, stay behind the king here and play a move like queen b1 and try to give his queen as much room to check as possible. But he played queen e6, which was the losing move according to the table basis. Now after king h4, queen h6, knight h5, the queen's mobility was quite reduced, and white's pawn is moving. So he played queen h7, but now e6. His rook is immune, because if he takes, then knight g7 check here and takes the queen. And now white is finally winning this game. So queen g6 was played. He could have played queen e7, which could have resulted in a study-like win with king g4. He still can't take because of knight g7, but queen here. And now white would have to find the incredible move rook d5 in this position, which stops queen g2 check. And more than that, it threatens rook d7 and knight f6. Or actually, in this position, actually, it's just threatening knight f6 straight, because king f8, rook d8, rook d7, and wins the queen. And if he takes, obviously, then knight f6 check is winning. But that would have won the game for Magnus. But queen g6 was played, and then rook f7 simply, because he cannot take on e6 because of check. takes, and king g5 and king f5 leads to a 1 endgame. So king d8 was tried, but then f5, now his pawns are moving. And after queen g1, Magnus made the final move, the final nail in the coffin with knight g7, and Nepo resigned in this position because there's no way to stop the promotion of these pawns now. If, let's say, queen h2 check, then the king hides behind the knight on g8, and now e7 and e8 is coming, and that's that. So fantastic game by Magnus Carlsen, and credit to Nepo for trying. He could have taken a draw, but he tried to complicate and he tried to create an interesting game. So he becomes part of chess history forever, until the next time when we find such a really long game played in a world championship match. But this one was indeed a thriller. So I look forward to the rest of the match, and I hope we see more such exciting games in the remainder of this match.